Give everyone a few minutes to pile in here. Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour. Happy New Year. Bonne année. And welcome to part 2 of our Diversity and Inclusion webinar series for historic places open to the public. This webinar will be recorded and the recording will be available afterwards. My name is Kirsten Vermacke and I'm a project manager with the National Trust for Canada. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a second-generation Canadian and a settler and guest on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people here in Ottawa. We recognize officially that our webinar participants live and work on the lands and territories of many Indigenous peoples across Canada, and we encourage you to reflect on the shared human experience of storytelling as placemaking and community building. It's through storytelling that we can learn from one another and create richer, more accurate stories of all these places that are important to us. So today, I'll get slide 2. If you want to move to slide 2, please, Nasim. Just take a moment to tell you a little bit about the National Trust for Canada. It's how we start all of our webinars. The National Trust is Canada's national charitable not-for-profit organization that leads and inspires action for places that matter. We have a long track record of heritage conservation and working with communities to save and renew historic places. At the National Trust, we're on a mission to bring heritage to life in more ways than one. We get people excited about places that matter, places that connect us to our roots and improve quality of life. We provide tools to save and renew historic places like regeneration works and a treasure trove of destinations to visit and discover. You can find us at our website or on social media. All of our information is at the bottom of this slide. Next slide, please. For today's webinar, I'd like to welcome back Karen Carter, the president and founder of Karen Carter and Associates Cultural Consulting. She's the former executive director of Heritage Toronto, the founding executive director of Museum of Toronto, and co-founder of Black Artists Network and Dialogue, an organization dedicated to the promotion of Black arts and culture in Canada and abroad. Karen's most recent project is as co-founder of the BIPOC Fellowship to help support the development of a more diverse cultural landscape in Canada. We're fortunate to have Karen with us today, leading the discussion on diversity and inclusion in historic places. This webinar series will be part of our Diversity and Inclusion in Historic Places resource kit for Historic Places Day 2023 and is made possible with support from the Department of Canadian Heritage. I'll give a brief overview of the Trust Historic Places Day program, as well as an introduction to our efforts so far in promoting diversity and inclusion in historic places open to the public. Karen will take over and share her presentation on public engagement and community outreach. We will leave your questions until the end of the webinar, but please use the Q&A feature to log questions at any point of the presentation. Vous pouvez poser des questions en français aussi. Part 1 of this series took place on December 13th and introduced us to some of the concepts that Karen will be exploring today, including finding new voices for your historic site, building culturally safe spaces for staff and visitors, and how to begin difficult conversations within your organization. This webinar will expand on those ideas and isn't necessary to have attended part 1 to be able to engage with us today. Links to both webinars will be included in the follow-up email to today's presentation. Next slide. If you're new to Historic Places Days, in brief, it is a national multi-day event in July, and it's designed to shine a spotlight on historic places from coast to coast to coast. Historic Places Days is really a platform. It's an opportunity to gain profile and visitors, and it exists as much online as it does in person and on the ground. The Trust is happy to be the lead partner to make Historic Places Days happen. We appreciate greatly the participation and the support of Parks Canada and close to 600 participating historic sites across the country. These are some of the statistics from the 2022 Historic Places Days, including our reach of 2.4 million Canadians, an attendance of approximately 350,000 Canadians during Historic Places Days to historic sites. And there were over 170 virtual and in-person events held during that time period as well. This past year, the Trust took a particular interest in creating more diverse content and building intentional relationships. The strategy was to take a regional focus and partner with organizations and individuals doing work on telling a fuller, more diverse story. A significant challenge to diversity is that built heritage generally remains for many, at its essence, a colonial project. As such, 2022 was an opportunity to reconsider and grow understanding of where the conversation about historic sites and built heritage fits into the larger work of inclusion, accessibility, decolonization, and reconciliation. We know that there are many stories that have been ignored or erased, and that communities across the country lack the resources or the support to fully share their story. Next slide. With a specific goal to tell more diverse stories and include more equity-seeking groups, the Trust reached out and established partnerships across Canada to develop connections with historic places that tell underrepresented stories. Funding was offered to community groups to encourage sites to create a listing on the HPD website, share their on-site events, and curate content and visit lists like the one that you see here on the screen. Heritage leaders in historic places are increasingly recognizing the imperative to build relationships, reach new audiences, and make space for narratives that tell a more inclusive story of Canada. It can be difficult to know where to start this process. And so this series of webinars will introduce these concepts and address some of the unique challenges that historic places face in Canada. These webinars will offer an informed exploration of diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism in historic places and equip participants to transform your storytelling going forward with confidence. We will identify potential barriers to more inclusive ways of storytelling and provide opportunities for intercultural knowledge sharing and exchange to identify best practices in telling more diverse stories and build community. This webinar series is our work at a first step towards relationship building, creating safe spaces, and answering some of the specific concerns that come from working with the heritage and tourism spheres. As registrants to today's webinar, you'll be invited to attend additional events in the series taking place further in the spring. So next slide. With that, I'd like to pass it over to Karen Carter for the rest of today's webinar on public engagement. Karen.
I might need to unmute. Thank you so much. Looking forward to having a discussion or getting some questions at the end. I think maybe our third session in this will be a bit more discussion oriented, but we wanted to start by me sharing some ideas that might be useful to folks. I'm going to acknowledge that I'm in Toronto, and as such, I'm on the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples, as well as Chippewa. And that as a woman of African descent, I feel a responsibility in this place where my people are here through choice and forced migration. There are lots of Indigenous Africans and others who have migrated into the Americas over the years by choice, but we also know that the transatlantic slave trade has brought people that look like me to this side of the world by force. So I think that results in my having a heightened sense of responsibility to these Indigenous peoples of these lands to be an ally and co-conspirator in their work and fight for human rights and social justice. So here's to more allies and co-conspirators. There's an interesting thing that happens in this work when you start to do a deep dive around placemaking and people and inclusion, and especially when it comes to the heritage sector, where there are a lot of well-meaning people who get up in the morning, a lot of whom are volunteers. They're paid or not paid or paid very little at times to work in this sector. And yet this idea of access and inclusion starts to turn what seems to be normal operating movements on its head. And it makes things like moments that would seem mundane or simple, like dressing to represent a particular culture, which has been a longstanding part of the sector's way of communicating and educating visitors, to modes of inquiry around people's heritage or a way of coming to be in this place at this time that lead to landmines. So I think I'm going to start off by just saying that if you're coming to this session, I'm hoping and you've done the first one, I'm hoping you're reflecting on some of the things that connect the thread, although as Christian so eloquently stated, it's not a necessity to have done the first session to be a part of this one. But if you did do the first one and you're here, then you'll see that I'm kind of building on by doing a deeper dive around some of the very practical things related to diversity and inclusion that are, some are new conversations, some are renewed conversations that are happening within the sector, just to hopefully give you a sense of the aha moment, as Oprah would say, or just that revelation of, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense to me now. Because I think if we have an understanding as to why things are being discussed or why things are being done the particular way beyond this tag of we want everybody to feel included. Because if at your core, you're like, I don't understand why everyone doesn't feel included. I'm including everyone. I'm not doing anything to not include them. But you may not have a deep enough understanding around how things like race, culture, language, gender, all these things play into the soup around people maybe not feeling included, even though at your core, you're not getting up in the morning to make anyone feel excluded, right? So the first slide, if you can move to the reflections on next steps and lessons learned that inform how we move forward. The goal here is that as I'm unpacking some of these, that I'm hoping you will be thinking about, oh, and that you will get some clarity that by the time I'm finished with this, which I think I'll keep to 15 to 20 minutes max, so we have more time for questions, you will hopefully have questions that help to answer some things that become really material and relevant and productive for your work. So that's a goal. As Christian stated, the Historic Places Days is a really practical public-facing program that's happening in heritage places across the country. And this layer of engagement and education around equity, access, inclusion, and diversity is really our trying to make sure that we all put our best foot forward and that the work you do is reaching its core goal, which is helping to introduce people and educate them about the history and cultures of this country. If you can go to the next slide. So there are things I think around interpretation that are considerations that have not always been clear. I think some of us have the understanding around what class means as a filter when you look at history. So I was listening to a conversation recently where someone was talking, I think they were talking to Bell Hooks. It actually may have been Charlie Rhodes, as a clip from a video from him in the 80s or 90s. And he was saying to her, is it true that Black women have not felt that the feminist movement have really been about them? And that, and then she said, yeah, because this idea of getting out to work has always been what Black women, and then they both mentioned, and women of lower class. So this idea of how the work we do filters not just around race and gender and culture, but also around class. And one may see the intersection or the notion of intersectionality across all of these four, because class is a huge filter. And so when you talk to people and they look, for instance, at the history of the Irish in Canada or the history of Jewish communities, and you know, you have a sense of people who came here with nothing, for whom getting over issues around class was more their driver, and culture, I guess for Jewish community folks, is as important. And sometimes I think if we have an understanding of what it means to really think about, am I delivering a program or a talk or an introduction with an understanding of how class filters as much as gender, race, and culture? It sometimes is a point of entry that's more comfortable, because sometimes when people get into gender, they're not necessarily aware of all the language. They're not necessarily clear about what it means when someone says they're trans, and how you are to approach them so that you are comfortable with they as opposed to he, she, or her, him. But class as a filter is a really important one that I think sometimes we don't hear enough about. We're often hearing about gender, race, And we're talking about culture in its broader sense in the way heritage fits into a broader cultural bucket. But when you start to think about how religion is a way that is, for Muslim people, a cultural driver, as it would be for Jewish people, and sometimes for other religions, as we know, there are people across the world that are being religiously persecuted for different religions. And so those drivers may impact the way you might engage with a Tibetan community, for instance, in Toronto. So these filters are what we're going to do a deeper dive on this week, and then just talk about how, again, you approach this work with grace. You forgive yourself because you're going to have missteps. You're human. We're all human. I've got stories of missteps around all four of these, but not to give up, to feel like you can stay in this work because you're coming to it with a sense of your humanity and humility. Next slide. So let's start with class. I think almost everyone, even for those who are coming from an upper echelon of class, when you say the word class, and maybe it's because of how our education system is structured, where we've, all heard about the bourgeoisie, and I feel like, I don't know about you, depending on where you went to grade school or high school, I feel like notions around class as it related to especially European history, and thus the waves of Europeans who came into the Americas, because we knew that it was the lower class, the people at the bottom of the pecking order, who were often prisoners or serfs who were not able to move forward in the world and get an opportunity to build a life in an unequal playing fields, who populated America. So I think some of us know about class, especially those of us who know general history, world history, have a sense of how class factors into the shade of someone's skin. So you may know, for instance, that in South Asian communities, where class is attached to caste. And so this sense that someone may feel a sense of racism because of the shade of their skin, that may even come from their particular cultural group, is something that is a driver to be aware of. Class is a factor when we're thinking about how someone who is presenting as white European may be walking through the world, especially when you scratch the surface and find out, oh, that person is of mixed heritage, but they present as a particular way publicly. So the way class filters into the history of this country, and sometimes the history of the place that you're in, is, I would say, a challenge for you to maybe take all of these four drivers and see if I look at the work I'm doing in this particular place through these filters, do I get some new learning? And do I get some language because of that learning of how I might be able to not necessarily present this, because you may not get to a point this early where you feel you're comfortable presenting a presentation around a visit from the general public that's related to class. But you may at least have new understanding, which may lead you to answer a question better from the member of the public, and also do some research to present information for the visitors. So I would say all of these four filters, but I feel like class is probably the one that, you can tell me if I'm crazy when we get to questions, or as you throw your questions in the chat now, but it feels like one of the ones that is easiest, that is most familiar, and may have the least landmines, because class is a driver across all cultures and race of lived peoples. Class would have been a driver even in ancient times around who was born into where. Class definitely would have been a driver even for indigenous peoples around leadership. Class is a filter that I think, if we look at, helps us to get a better general human understanding about the work that we're doing. Next slide. So one of the reasons for this photo being there is on a practical sense. I think I said this in the last webinar. I think we have to start to think about gender and the way notions of gender identity are being positioned in this time, so that we make room for those who are trans. And I won't get into the clinical sense of what that means medically, because that, I won't lie to you, is what helped me to understand where people were coming from around transgender identity, because it felt like I had come of age in an era where someone being gay or straight or queer identified made sense to me. I understood that language, but they still presented as a he or she. And my understanding and engagement with them was about who they may choose to have as their life partner in who they love, basically. And that they may choose to love someone of the same sex as opposed to a different gender. So now the trans aspect of it was for me a thing that I needed to do more learning on, and it is still a process. And I will readily admit, as recently as last year, there was a staff member who wrote a formal letter to the board about me not respecting their gender identity, and so I can put my hand up to say I'm probably with a whole bunch of you around how it is you communicate when someone's pronoun is they, and the importance of respecting the way someone chooses to identify or how they choose to call themselves. I think one of the triggers for me that helped was there is a thing for those of us who are coming from Black and other Indigenous communities where sometimes people change names to have a name that better represents who they feel they are based on their cultural awareness. So there was a big wave when I was in university at York in the 90s, where people were changing names to African names because they felt they wanted to reclaim that history and drop what they saw as colonial names. And I remember being in a discussion where there was an argument about why people did this and whether it was performative. And my position at the time, after the discussion, landed on people have a right to be called what they choose, especially when you become an adult. And so that line of someone has a right to be addressed or called what they choose based on their notion of self. And I have a responsibility to respect that. I think that's the trigger that is now in my head, that whoever I am addressing, and if I'm unsure, then to lead with a they as opposed to assume he, she, because I also am not necessarily even at the place where I think I'm good at even inquiring how someone chooses to do their pronouns. So they is safer for everyone. So that's a tool that I use. I think you will all come up with your tools. And as I said about class, I would encourage you to take all 4 of these drivers, the glory of the interweb of Father Google, just Google transgender, gender identity, Google some of these things just to get some of the language, get yourself comfortable. And it may not mean you get perfectly there, you'll have some missteps, but you'll be on your way to education. And if you're lucky enough to have the resources in your organizations, I would also say hiring somebody to come in and do this work, because it is probably of the 4, the one that is the newest and the one that is getting a lot of well-meaning people who have worked in the sector for forever in trouble when the folks who are transgendered and choose to be identified and are communicating their pronouns to be they, them, do not feel that it's being respected in an organization. And so sometimes that training is a really essential part of showing the organization and your team is doing that work. But if you don't have the resources, I do think there's a lot of stuff out there. And one of the things that we will do with the final toolkit is to add some articles, add some names of professionals that are doing this work that you could read, or videos that you could watch that just does a much deeper dive around the gender identity piece. And then tools such as this, that you just have something like this on a washroom so that there is a place for those who don't identify as male or female, but identify as trans, that they feel that's a safe space for them to do. There are little things like the miracle of a restroom being clear as a safe space for someone is really, I think, important. Next slide. As I said, these 4 pillars, I think race, culture, and class are the ones that are most familiar. I think when we get into notions around race, one of the things that I think is essential right now is how the heightened understanding of race as it relates to Black cultural communities in Canada has been punctuated over the last couple of years coming out of the George Floyd murder in the US, and the fact that because of COVID, we were all home and kind of online and watching these conversations unfold in social media and through the news. So I think there's, again, research, do some work, do some checking, but start to look at things like anti-Black racism. What does that even mean? Why are we talking about that there's a special way racism impacts Black Canadians as opposed to others? For me as a Black woman, I feel like this is stuff that's kind of in my DNA, and that the history wonk in me had early from history classes at York University when I was there, had a really heightened understanding around the transatlantic slave trade, the place of Blacks in Canada, and also just, I think this is a recent thing that has come about for me, where I have an understanding that the Indigenous lands that were taken, stolen, and the forced free labor of African slaves is what built the modern day capitalist system. And so that is my Coles Notes shift. And that is, it's not a thing I say very often because I feel like it's a hammer for most people, because then they're like, what? But if you actually research and you know the history of how capitalism formed and how Europe became as wealthy, especially British imperial machine became as wealthy as it did because it was able to build wealth by not paying for labor. And when you have free labor and you've taken free land, you're able to build things as we know, because that's pretty much the existence of the Americas. Because of that, because of that atrocity, both on the stolen land and the loss of the lives of and cultures of Indigenous people, and on the moving of people in the millions into a place, and then the loss of language and culture and lives on both sides for both of those communities. So when I speak of the allyship, for me and for a lot of Black folks for Indigenous cultures, it is that heightened understanding. So I think the race driver right now is when you hear the words BIPOC, and it's funny, here's a little funny thing that I learned from one of the smarter young people that are around me, who tell me things that make me then feel a little smart for 5 seconds, was that the idea of BIPOC was supposed to be Black and Indigenous people of color. So it was supposed to be heightening Black and Indigenous people, but then people took it to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So however you choose to understand it, it is important to know that that acronym is really about you having a much more heightened understanding of Black and Indigenous folks and their particular struggle in the Americas, as I think that term came out of US conversations. So again, I'll probably repeat it when I get to culture, which is the next one. Research. Take some time to look at these 4 pillars and comparing them as they relate to your own work in your particular lane, site, communities, because some of this will help you make sense of a lot of stuff that's coming at you that you may never have actually stopped and broken out into these smaller parts to get a more material understanding. Culture, I'm glad that Christian included this photo of Grisette. Actually, it's not Grisette Park, Christian, my bad. It's actually Ireland Park. Grisette Park is another one that is, I don't know how I missed this, my bad, because she did send this to me to check. I think I was looking at it on my cell phone. Anyways, but the Ireland Park, which is on the lakeshore in Toronto, sits close to actually beside Billy Bishop Airport. And these are 3 of the sculptures from an Irish artist, Roland Gillespie, who did it as a representation and an homage to the Irish famine. Folks, I guess settlers who would have come in the 1800s to Toronto and basically changed the landscape of the city, because I think they doubled the population of Toronto at the time. The story around the Irish is a really interesting one, and I think it's similar for Jewish around how culture as a driver, because you can look at someone and they just look white European and you assume they sit in the seats of privilege that we've seen history has given a lot of European peoples. Part of that around how Europe helped to underdevelop Africa is actually, I think, how Europe underdeveloped Africa is a title of a book by, I can't remember his name. It'll be included in the research tools that we send at the end. But this book gives you a kind of play-by-play on how every European country had a hand in some way as a colonizer in different parts of the continent. But the ones who frankly did not are, I think Scotland and Ireland are one of the few who did not have that. And there are other Eastern European countries who I think fall into those buckets, smaller ones. So I think a lot of us as Canadians know the history of the Irish, know why the term Black Irish came about, know the struggles of the Irish around the Orange Order, just that they're general things that we are aware of. And if we're not, that this for me is an example of how when you come to things from culture, you may be more comfortable getting a heightened understanding around how a particular cultural group has had to overcome struggles and deal with different atrocities. And that may give you an understanding how then race, gender, and class factors into the bigger picture for all of us. So don't be afraid, basically, to come to this work with a more comfortable lane or a comfort zone that is maybe a European study of this work or a European culture study of these histories that then give you some of the tools for how you then address it in places around races and community groups and cultural groups that maybe may feel less forgiving if you have a misstep. And I say that to say you could probably find somebody who's an Irish community person. Definitely the Ireland Park Foundation would be great for this. If you Google them, they'll come up. They've got work they're doing on a site in Toronto. They've got tons of Irish folks doing scholarship work at York, folks doing stuff in the East Coast because of the nature of how the Irish language has changed based on the significant presence of Irish folks in places like Newfoundland and other places on the East Coast. So they're just ways that get you in. And the reason, as I say, for unpacking these in these 4 buckets is to try to very practically give you some tools to say, how do I get into this work to arm myself, to inform myself so that I am comfortable as a person working in the heritage sector with this knowledge? And sometimes, as I said, if it all comes to you in a big soup, a big ball, you don't find a point of entry. So this breakdown of these is to give you 4 points of entry that you can go through to start to connect the work you're doing in a particular community, organization, or cultural group with these drivers that are essential to understanding how to do your work effectively in the 21st century. Next slide. So I would say one of the things here is to always think about you're building relationships because of your work around those 4 pillars. If you do the work around those 4 pillars, you will inevitably build new relationships. You build the new relationships because of the research that comes from those pillars. And you also build the new relationships because you are better informed to be able to participate in discussions, in collaborations, in programming that feels human and accessible. Basically, I think also just drags your work into the realities of today. But I'm also cognizant of keeping some of the old ones. So I think I alluded to this in the last session that not everybody's there. Sometimes we think, oh, if you do all this work, everyone's going to be happy. There will be people who just kind of dig their heels in and decide, I'm not really here for that. And I think you have to be ready to release people with some grace and love, hoping that they'll find their way back. So my rule is, if you're working in the culture sector, you never really want to close the door on someone. You want to be optimistic that they'll find their way in, but you still have to move forward and you still have to think about, am I doing the work that will ensure the legacy of this organization so that it is here 50, 100, 200 years from now, because it's been equipped to deal with the reality. Like it or not, telling half of a story, kind of burying your head about the other half, doesn't make sense for any of us. Telling the whole story, but doing it in a non-judgmental way so that people feel they're informed, not that they're being, having information weaponized against them, I think is essential. Next slide. So I think this is my last one, finding your happy place. And it is probably the image you'll keep seeing as we keep doing this. You got to do this work with grace for yourself and grace for others. You got to be able to forgive yourself for the missteps, even if someone else doesn't. And that grace is what will allow you to forgive them or understand why they choose to not forgive you if you're not, saying the right thing or showing up the right way for something they think you should. But I would say taking the time to go at it through those 4 pillars will help you do the work to ready yourself. It's like, can't go run a marathon and not train. So this is some of the training. It's like, you don't make it to the Olympics without doing some work. So it's how you do some of the work in order to prepare for the more public facing side of what you do. I think that's me. I'm ready to take your questions. I think you're muted. Or yeah.
So we're open for questions if anyone has any. So we have the Q&A box is open. We have the chat is open as well. This is Karen's contact information if you'd like to reach Karen directly. And I think our final slide just says questions on it. So thank you, Karen. That was, I was really excited when I saw the 4 pillars that you were sharing. And I thought class was such an interesting one to start with. I think a lot of, especially historic places open to the public, there's been this sort of flip in the last maybe even decade or more to start talking about those alternative histories. We sort of look at the Victorian House Museum and saying, okay, well, who worked here? Who were the servants here? Who built this home? Not necessarily wanting to focus solely on sort of the great Canadian sort of dialogue or the idea of who were the fancy rich people who lived in this building, but who built it, who worked there. I think classes, I hadn't thought of it necessarily as part of this work, but it's a great way of opening it up. Like you said, it's a great way of starting that conversation about alternative stories, the full story, and different ways that people, not only different ways that people come to find you now, different ways that people might identify themselves, and ways of making your visitorship feel more welcome and more accepted, by understanding that those sort of class divides still exist here, and they exist in countries where people might be coming from as well, but historically also, to tell a more fulsome story, including different class divides during the historical period that your site explores. That was really interesting. I really appreciate that inclusion of class. I think, do you have an example of somewhere that you've seen do something really interesting with this idea of class, or examining class, that would sort of maybe inspire some of us?
I will address that, but I'm also going to just quickly say that Emma Lang had posted that 50 plus years would add legal immigration status as well. And it's funny because for me, that's actually the example that I have, is how immigration and class intersect. Because a lot of the people I know who are struggling with immigration, or who have, like my own father came here as a farm worker and then lived under the table when he left the farm working before getting the funds to get a lawyer to get his status legal. I mean, he has a story about a Jewish man who owned a company that was a launderer for hotel linens, and he was working there, and the gentleman had been super kind to him, frankly helped him. If not for him, we probably wouldn't have been able to migrate, because he helped him get settled. He gave him the money to do the truck driving test. And then he also helped him when literally immigration was showing up looking for him. And he was like, get out the back door type of thing. Yeah, there's a movie there. But yeah, I think the examples for me around class are often related to just how resources impact the life you get to build. So I've seen it come up in conversations around Chinatowns in Toronto, the downtown big one on Spadina, and the fact that in the 90s, when Chinese migrants were coming from Hong Kong, they were coming with money. If you recall, there was a transition of the colonial back of China going back to out of English hands back to China. So how Hong Kong was moved back. And so there's a ton of money in Hong Kong that just was like not trying to be there and left. And so those people, when they came and built shiny, glossy, fancy Chinatowns in the north of the city in Markham in the 905, because for them, the Chinatown in Toronto was more of a peasant Chinatown, which spoke to the class of rural migration that would have built that Chinatown. And if you know anything about the history of the Chinese in Toronto and in Canada, you know that the different waves came more as laborers, and they would not have come with crazy money for investing in shiny buildings until the 90s, or in big waves, because I'm sure they did before that. But as far as a large wave that would have impacted the condos streams in Vancouver, just impacted a bunch of things globally because they were showing up with money. So it's how, when you live in capitalism, how the ability to have financial means is a driver for class, because money and class have that intersection. But then it's also that aspect of, we also know, as my aunt loves to remind me, money doesn't make you classy. It doesn't necessarily give you the social drivers that are also a part of class. Because I also know people who are really good with the social drivers around something as simple as, sitting at a fancy table and knowing which spoon or which fork to reach for. That's a factor of class. And I've been on the receiving end, which is probably my personal story of it, where I was at a house for a dinner in Rosedale, and I was sitting beside somebody. I was the only Black person at the dinner, something related to some museum work I was doing. And I remember the person who sat beside me sighing. They kind of sat and they're like, oh gosh. And then they said, oh, I'm glad it's you, because we can figure it out together. And then I was like, what are you talking about? Then I realized, oh, you're assuming that because I'm the Black woman at the table, I don't know which knife and fork or spoon to reach for too. And then I looked at them and said, actually, I came from really snobby Caribbean grandparents who taught me how to sup, as my grandmother would say, at any table with kings and paupers. I can tell you what to do if you'd like. And then I kind of walked them through it, and they looked a little bit, blue for the rest of the dinner, but it's kind of like, why are you assuming I don't know this? So class, I think, factors in capitalism around things like money, but I think it also factors around the niceties of social engagement, social norms, and knowing what to say when, knowing how to greet people based on their title or status. It's the briefing you get when you go to the LG's events, right? It's the protocols when she's being hosted. So I think class factors in a whole bunch of ways. And I think all of those lend themselves to actually really great storytelling that are usually not as harsh or threatening, whether it's about people's wealth and how it impacted the way they moved through the world, or even though they were no longer wealthy, because they were raised in a particular way, they were able to access and straddle certain social circumstances.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's a great point. You sort of brought up, I really liked your phrase, release people, hoping they will find their way back. And Sonia makes a comment as well that, like, the statement about weaponizing words. And I think a lot of the comments we've received about the first webinar, and then also the feedback during this webinar, is sort of the gentleness that you're sort of walking us through, this idea of grace that you keep sharing. And I think that that's something that in the work of diversity and equity and inclusion and reconciliation, when you're trying to create these policies or tell these stories or train your staff, there's this sort of pressure, obviously, to get it right and get it right the first time. But I really like this idea of releasing people, especially when we're talking about visitors. And if someone isn't ready to have this conversation, I know this question came up in the last webinar, what do you do when someone comes to your building and doesn't like the story you're telling? Or what do you do when someone on the board doesn't like the angle you want to take? Then I like this concept of just really hoping they'll find their way back, but saying this is our priority, and we're gently releasing you from this conversation.
You gotta wow, hello from Brazil. Look at that. So I just got distracted by the Brazil bit. It's not an easy thing to release people, so let me say that. And I use the word grace because for me it sums up that idea of grace isn't about grace is an in spite of word. It's not a because of. Grace is an in spite of feeling and action. It is not a because of. And I think we often live in a world that is very because of. So you treat someone based on how they treat you. And what grace says is you treat someone with kindness in spite of how they treated you. And for me, what it does is it frankly frees you as the person who's trying to do this work, because then you can, you release it, frankly, I'll say selfishly, so you can come back to this work the next day. Because if you don't release it, you go home with that toxicity and it harms you. Because often the people who are spewing their inflexibility or more worse than the inflexibility, just the vitriol of anger or unkindness against you because of this work. And then if you take it, and it is a necessity to weigh to make sure, okay, am I not doing this right? Am I, you don't want to dismiss it. So when I say release them, it isn't a dismissing. It is if you've done your due diligence, you've communicated well, if this is work that has been informed and people have had a chance to give their input, you've been respectful when they've disagreed, and they're still just not open or flexible to moving forward, you have to be able to, and releasing doesn't necessarily mean they leave, right? Because I think the story I told last time was that woman who was on Heritage Toronto's board. She didn't leave right away. She was there. She still finished her term. But what I did was in releasing her, every engagement with her, you get more bees with honey. I was as kind as I could be, and to the point of probably performative, but I just went out of my way to say hello, to ask her how she was, to let her drive the conversation about what she wanted to talk about. I didn't bring up stuff that I knew was going to upset her because there wasn't a point. She was in her 80s and she was not going to change for me. So I had to release her. Mm-hmm. But I think in releasing someone in their 60s or 40s or 30s who's younger, who may come around, you still come to them with that kindness and grace. And especially as we know on boards and in communities, you can often have people doing things that are not putting them in direct contact with the public, so that there are ways for them to engage. And if everyone agrees that you can still be engaged, you just can't do these things, we can't risk the damage to the organization's reputation. Often also the thing that saves you, and I won't lie, knock on wood, I've sometimes lied and said it's funding, even though it's not. I've said, well, the funding requirements, so we can't really risk this. Just the things that help to save you, because you're just moving them out of the line of fire that is going to go frankly through them to you. Because that's the other thing. Often the people who are weaponizing words against you or doing these things, they're not really directly harmed. They're harming the organization, or they're harming you. They're harming the next generation who was to come to keep delivering on this work. So do the release, do the save yourself, do the save your team. And in a perfect world, they shuffle off and out to something else, or because for me, those are the two options. It's great if they just decide, okay, this is not the right place for me, or they stay and they come around. And those are, for me, they're two wins, because the ability for someone to move to elsewhere, that's their prerogative. But I also think it's as much of a win. Sometimes we think the only win is that they have to stay and buy in. No, sometimes the win is peace out. Like, go live your best life. We wish you well, but this what we need to do for this organization and for the work, for the narratives, for the stories, for building community, for building the next generation of leadership requires that we are open to, as I said, that whole story, the full story. And this work for me is as simple as that is. We know parts of the story, quarters of the story, half the story, sometimes 3/4 of the story has been told. And we're in this dance for the whole story. We want the truth, nothing but the truth, the whole truth, so that everybody gets to get a clear understanding, and that we're able to understand why we are where we are and why we're dealing with the things we're dealing with, because we understand the full narratives.
Yeah.
I'm just going to quickly respond to Brazil to say we will add lists, because there are books that inform what I do. So we'll make sure that's a list. I think it's Walter Rodney's How Europe All Underdeveloped Africa is the book, I think. But there are things like that that just give you a sense of why people may be walking through the world. There's Bell Hooks books, like there's, as I said, the one about the feminism narrative. There's things that give you some context that we'll include as the reading list.
Absolutely. We have a couple of comments here coming in at the end, but Catherine Watts has just shared that she saw the reimagining of life at Spadina House in Toronto. This story was one of the family who lived there that was Black, because history has been rewritten in a colonial perspective. That I was going to mention that as well, that something really interesting happening, and I know it's in Toronto, which not everyone has access to, a historic place in downtown Toronto, but right now the City of Toronto Museums are doing this incredible work as part of their Awakenings program, and which is sort of trying to awaken the diversity of Toronto in these historic places that often tell sort of a one-note colonial story. And Dismantle is a reimagining of the Spadina House as using modern art. It's incredible. And so I recommend everyone go to their website, check it out. It's a really beautiful way of bringing in artists and also reimagining the space. So they've reimagined it as if there was a very powerful modern Black family living in this house that was built for white settlers. And they're taking a story from the house's history, a true story, and reimagining using those historical figures. And it's incredible. And it's a great way of taking a small piece of history that you know is associated with your site and reimagining it and telling it in a way that's really going to make people think and people experience your space differently, by bringing in other partners too. And they won a National Trust Governors Award for this work this past fall as well. So Catherine, that was a great example, and I'm glad it shook you like it shook me when we were there for a conference in October.
I'll just quickly jump in and say the note that Natalie's put around the board. This is for the board, Natalie. As I said, this is often boards are doing volunteer work alongside staff. And so everything I'm saying is the requirement for board as well as for staff in order to prepare to engage to do the work effectively. I'll just quickly comment on the use of historic places for new things. It's a Jane Jacobs thing. I feel like a lot of us in the heritage sector know this idea of historic old buildings need new things. And so if you don't have the resources of the City of Toronto to do something big and splashy like that, just use that Jane Jacobs idea of old buildings need new ideas. And how can you use your space, if you have space, for that? But I'm also cognizant of just that idea of locations needing new ideas, so that if you're not in a building, but you're commemorating a location, and that your work may be about a particular location and its history, is how do you connect some new ways of knowing around that place? Because I think the danger is that we think you can only engage with new ideas around a particular place's history because it's a building, and then you can talk about that built form and why it was built and who it was built for. So just keep that in mind if you don't have those resources to do a big splashy thing, and you don't necessarily have the resources for the artists. Although the great thing about bringing art, which is the thing I like about that example, is that you can get grants for artists to do things and then offer up your space. And I would say you don't even need, here's the historic thread. It just the way that it's space, and you invite people in to take over those space in different ways. And often artists will then figure out where the connective is. so you don't have to do that work if you don't have the resources. I'm just aware that depending on the range of capabilities and resources on the line, just don't be afraid to think about this work and those partnerships in ways that bring in those different ideas and perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And telling invisible stories is something that we explored a little bit last year with historic places, trying to find ways to tell stories that are place-based when there is no physical space either anymore or there never was. And that goes for buildings that have disappeared. That goes a lot of time for historical cemeteries. And the example that you had given of the Irish history as well, so the Irish hospital that's no longer there, and how to tell that story now in the modern space of what used to be. And that's something that we'll be sharing resources hopefully on some of the more interesting best practices in that work as well, to be able to tell the stories. So we have some really great comments happening in the chat.
Yeah. I totally agree, Emma, about the immigration and people assuming that if you're coming from the US, it's easy to move to Canada. Totally with you there.
Yep. Absolutely. And talk about assumptions. And I'm really appreciating the conversation happening in the chat. We are out of time officially. From 12 to 1 was our time, but this is fantastic. And thank you everyone for participating. And I hope you're seeing names in the chat of people you know and you can reach out to and continue this conversation. We will be continuing this conversation in the future in further webinars. There will be a full package. Our diversity resource kit will include links. It will include recommendations of other webinars and books and resources that can sort of help you start or continue this work, regardless of where you are in the journey and where your organization is in the journey as well. So I just want to thank Karen again for joining us. This was illuminating, and I hope everyone is leaving with some inspiration on how to continue this journey individually and as an organization by telling a more fulsome story in our Canadian historic places. So thank you, everyone. Our contact information will be in the follow-up email as well if you want to reach out to Karen or myself with further questions or topics you'd like us to touch on in the future or any needs that you have. So thank you again. And thank you very much, Karen. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.